Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm Jonathan Weber. I'm the global tech editor for Reuters, based here at our Asia headquarters in Singapore as of just a few months ago, indicative of our commitment and interest in Asia as part of the global tech story. So happy to be here with a great panel.
Sure. I'm Sult, the CTO and co-founder for Horangi. We're a cybersecurity company based here in Singapore. Myself and the other co-founder come from Palantir. We learned a lot of lessons there about how to deal with cyber and decided to start a company here in Singapore.
And I'm Ratala. I'm the head of Slush Singapore. So this is the third edition of Slush Singapore that you're participating in, and great to see so many of you here.
I'm Peng T. I'm a managing partner at Monks Hill Ventures. We've been investing in Southeast Asia for the last 4 or 5 years.
Great. So Slush and Monks Hill collaborated on a report to give a little bit of a sense of the scale of the startup community in Southeast Asia. A total of 1,400 deals worth $11 billion over the last 5 years, which is a striking number. A lot of that is Singapore, 8.4 billion of the 11 billion in Singapore, which kind of makes sense. But I'm curious as to whether you think that Singapore will remain that dominant as a kind of center of the startup community in Southeast Asia, or whether that'll start to distribute more to some of the other capitals.
Sure. I think Singapore is a really good hub, and it was a really good place to get started kind of in the startup scene. But as we're seeing like the adoption of cloud technology, and it's a little bit easier to decentralize your technical networks, we're also starting to see that it's easier to learn and get into technology, right? So the startup scenes that we're parts of in Korea and Hong Kong and the Philippines and Jakarta, they're all starting to gain a lot of traction, and we're starting to see a lot of growth there too.
So Jakarta and Philippines in particular you'd point to?
I would say probably Korea. So there's a startup scene around the cryptocurrency there, and Jakarta are the strongest and most quickly growing. But there's this big startup scene in the Philippines. It's not growing quite as fast, but it's going to hit critical mass in a couple of years.
And just to follow up on that, is there a kind of a locus in the Philippines of what the interest is there? What types of businesses?
I think it's a mix of everything. I don't think there's I mean, cryptocurrency is pretty popular, and there's also some there's a big fad with bike sharing in the Philippines for a while. With startups, I'm not really sure exactly which direction it's going to head. Like I said, it's not heading in one direction really fast. It's just this big mass of startups that are it'll hit critical mass soon, and we'll start seeing some things pop up that are very interesting.
And to add to kind of the first question, I mean, obviously Singapore is such a hub for the Southeast Asia, and I kind of see that it probably will continue to be in a very dominant position when it comes to deal flows or capital flows and so on. But what I do see is that the surrounding region developing more and more, and countries like you mentioned, Indonesia and Philippines and Thailand and so on, that the total size of the deals is going to grow. So I think that proportionally Singapore probably will remain in the head position, but the total amount of deals and capital flow is probably going to increase in the region.
I agree. I think the challenge of Singapore is it's actually a very, very tiny market. So companies might be coming in here and using it as a base, like yourself, Lee, and then going out to the region to do business. So I think we could probably do a little bit better in terms of resolution on the 4 billion coming in and all that, and where actually does it end up going to, right? A lot of companies, because of the local corporate laws, end up setting up a holding company that's Singaporean. So the funding goes into that entity. And then the fees, engineering costs and all that are coming out of that entity, going to those various different countries around Southeast Asia. So we don't, I think, account for that as well in the report. Maybe we could do a better job with it next year.
So in effect, a big chunk of that money that is sort of shows up as going into Singapore is actually going into some of the other places in the region.
That's correct.
Yeah. One thing that I couldn't quite tell from the numbers yet, kind of 5-year period there for that number. I mean, has it accelerated in the last couple of years, or has it been somewhat steady over that 5-year period?
I think generally, I mean, when you think about the startup ecosystem, be it in Singapore or Southeast Asia, I mean, you see 5 years ago, there wasn't really that much of a startup scene at all, right? It was just very much emerging. 7, 8 years ago, there were like a handful of startups, not just in Singapore, but in the region. And so I think that in the past 5 years, I think that it's pretty natural that we see this trend because there's just been a tremendous amount of new companies being set up and just this whole startup hype, I think, kind of landing in the region as well.
I think it's, you can see well, I don't know how much we should believe in unicorns as indicators, but in the last 5 years, I would say about 10 unicorns have been created in Southeast Asia alone. And so, we've had our first decacorn or super unicorn recently. And just yesterday, there are 2 companies that announced that they had billion-dollar fundings at billion-dollar valuations. So 2 more, right? So the rate of high value creation is happening in the region right now. How excited we should get about that, I'm not sure. Some of it's because of a bubble, but some of it's real. You know, you don't get people paying $1 billion for a company if they don't think it's worth something, at least $1 billion, right?
So what do you think is in a bubble? Where are the bubbles?
Sorry, what's the question?
What do you think? You mentioned that, you know, some of it is part of a bubble. I mean, are there certain areas that you think are a bubble at the moment?
Personally, I think that the bubble is more global.
Can you speak more?
The bubble is more global than local. So you see reasonable valuations in companies that are raising $5-10 million. But once they start to hit the $100 million range, the valuations just go up. And that's because there's I think a lot of PE money around the world that's looking for these big deals that can deploy big chunks of money that can grow fast. So if you get up to hundreds of millions in valuation, funding gets a lot easier because there's a lot of capital out there, and therefore it pushes the valuations up also.
You know, you mentioned so this question of Singapore being the capital, and one of the advantages it has is good legal structures and good government, I guess, in general. Do you see the other governments around the region kind of getting their act together in that regard?
Yeah, I think we are seeing that. Like one of the challenges in setting up a business or setting up a subsidiary in other countries is that just setting up the business is difficult, right? Figuring out how you might have to pay taxes or any of these things. We've seen like significant changes, or maybe we've just learned more about how that works in Korea and the Philippines. I think really the key when the startup space takes off in the Philippines is when they simplify that business process, right? That's when we'll see it really attract the real talent, and we'll see unicorns start coming. Is when it becomes easy to start a business. Jakarta too, with the unicorns coming out of Indonesia, they've kind of started to simplify that process, or they've added enough people to help kind of walk a company through it. And I think we're going to see the same thing around the region, right? Like that's what helps a company move somewhere, is making that process as simple as possible.
Kind of simplification of business formation.
Yeah, and I mean, we see that a lot when we go, and we've done some touring around the region as Slush Singapore as well, and we've spoken with some of the government representatives in Malaysia and Thailand, and you definitely do see that they get really, really excited about all this buzz that is generated not just by us, but generally in Singapore, for example, and they really want to be a part of that. I think that the tricky question is, one thing is to want to do that, and the other thing is to really, I mean, it's a pretty big thing to start saying, oh, okay, let's introduce some tax incentives, or let's change the legislation, let's help entrepreneurs. So it's one thing to want to be a part of the buzz versus actually doing the actions. But at the same time, from the startup's point of view, I would just say that, rather than waiting for governments to maybe introduce something, like just do it, right? Like just start doing it, and the more we create that buzz, I think that will then in turn make the governments really realize that if you want to keep these startups in the country and help them to employ hire people and get resources and get the funding, you should really do something to keep them here. So it can go the other way around.
So we have a question from the audience on a similar kind of theme. How innovative is Singapore's startup culture compared to other places in Southeast Asia?
That's a fair question. I would say Singapore is quite innovative, right? And I think the reason that Singapore is innovative is we have, the customers that we talk to here from a cybersecurity perspective, they have a fairly mature or robust cybersecurity program or capability already. Like, we'll see that they have firewalls, or they're already thinking about like antivirus, or what types of things their company may need to secure, right? Like, what are the risks that are related to cybersecurity? And I think that's true also in other industries or for other types of startups. Like, people here are thinking like business risk and down the road. I think the unicorns that we see elsewhere are more like business to consumer type unicorns. And really what you do is you take an existing technology and you make it work in a new region. So it's kind of innovation, but more kind of like modification. But we will start to see that innovation coming up, and I think the key to that is cloud technology, right? Where you don't have to stand up all of these server farms and everything else. You can just spin up something on AWS or GCP and call it done.
Yeah, and I think that kind of to add to that, I think that again, like when you looked at maybe like even 3 to 5 years ago, there was a lot of, apps, there was a lot of like e-commerce and platforms, and a lot of the good ideas that have already been done somewhere in the world to just, were brought to Southeast Asia, and there were a lot of, similar ideas that were just localized, which is good, but it's not innovation per se. So like, yeah, good buzz. But now we definitely see a lot of shift towards more deep tech and more like R&D focused. That's, I mean, innovation is such a broad word, but to me, that's really what innovation means, right? You create something new from scratch and hopefully bring that then to the world, which is also, I think, something that companies in this part of the world could do even better, right? To take the ideas and startups and bring them to the world. But yeah, so definitely I think that there's that shift happening.
I'm reminded of this quote by Bill Joy, who was an early internet computer guy, who co-founded Sun. He said the best people work for other companies, right? I think the same can be said of countries and cities. The best people work in other cities. And the game we're playing now is which city can get the most interesting people to work in it. I think Singapore, because of its relatively liberal immigration policies, if you go into a tech company, you actually don't know which country you're in, because there's people from all over the world there. There are Russians there, there's Chinese there, there's people from all over the world, Americans, and so on. And I think that is why the variety of views you get within one small place is why you get innovation and entrepreneurship going. I think the other countries, Thailand, for example, Indonesia, they're starting to understand this. You see the immigration policies, fits and starts, and getting easier in these places.
So on this question of what's real innovation and bringing innovation to other places, I mean, one of the things that I pay a lot of attention to at Reuters and looking at this region is you have these giant companies, giant American companies, giant Chinese companies, which all see Southeast Asia as just a market, kind of a greenfield market opportunity, huge populations who have not had access to a lot of basic kinds of internet services. And they're pouring a lot of money into it. I mean, certainly here in Singapore, Google has a huge presence here. Facebook has a huge presence here. I mean, is that kind of activity sort of positive by and large for the startup community, or is it kind of something that maybe threatens to kind of squeeze it a little bit, either by sucking the talent out of it or by taking over a lot of the markets that startups might be going after?
I can certainly speak to this as, from having to hire and work with folks from these other organizations, right? When you have the Googles and the Facebooks and these other large companies come in, they don't suck the talent away. Like, they create the talent, right? They set the expectation for a barrier of entry for the kids coming out of college. Like, this is how good I have to be. And then when they join the Facebooks and the Googles and they work there for a couple of years, they come out as really well-rounded engineers in general. And you also have some folks that are working on discrete projects inside Facebook or Google, and you have some folks that are very, very narrowly focused experts. So I think overall it's healthy, at least from my perspective. If I try to look at it at a larger perspective, I struggle a little bit. I don't really see where that's going to go or how it's going to affect like Singapore or like Jakarta, for example. So in Jakarta, there's less emphasis on like Google and Facebook, and you see more emphasis on like Gojek and Tokopedia, Traveloka, and so on. And we see the same sort of thing happen there. Is we get these engineers that have gotten experience, that have founded these companies, and they are raising their own world-class engineers, right? So I think the Googles and the Facebooks, they get the process started, and then we get another couple of unicorns, and they just take it off. And that's where the innovation starts, right? It's that barrier to entry. How do you attract good engineers? How do you train good engineers? And how do you make sure the technology already is deployed so that you can build something new?
Yeah, and I mean, from another angle as well, I think that it's good, sometimes for startups, it's good that you have some big competitors on the market, right? Like say your Amazon comes and everybody, and then yes, it is tough for the startups, but you have to up your game then, right? Because if you're the best out of all the startups, then are you really world class, or you're just the best because there isn't anybody else? And I think a lot of the times when, you ask founders of startups, oh, who's your competitor? Very often they go, oh, we don't really have, competition. It's like, okay, like really? And so to really kind of like make sure that, yeah, you can't say that, right? Like there are all these big giants. Yes, there are competition. You have to up your game. And yeah, it doesn't necessarily end well for everybody, but that's just how it goes. That's just business. But I do see that there is one concern as well, which is then the complete lack of competition, right? So if a big player comes in, buys everybody, the other ones die and don't survive, then from a consumer's point of view or a customer's point of view, obviously it's not a favorable solution either. So then I think that the startups would just have to hustle harder, right? Like, and make sure that they provide something that these big giants don't, right? They're much more agile and can be much more resourceful.
Yeah, I was listening to a conversation between a VC, a board member, and an entrepreneur in Beijing. It's very interesting. This guy was complaining, the entrepreneur was complaining how hard it is to find engineers and retain them, etc. The engineers would jump ship every 1-2 years and all that. And the VC said, look, at least if they jump ship every 1-2 years, you can get some of them on your end, right? So it turns out that if you study ecosystems, the more vibrant the ecosystem, the more competitive it is, especially for talent. So it's a good thing that there's a talent base that can move around and help you build businesses. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I think the challenge is also not just the big American, big Chinese companies. If you look at what's driving engineering costs up in Jakarta, in Singapore, it's actually our local guys. Grab, Gojek, all these guys are pushing the salaries through the roof.
All right, well, I guess, in some ways it's these markets are at different stage of development, but certainly in the U.S., I know in Silicon Valley, where I came from recently, it is an issue for, especially in certain areas like AI, where the big companies can pay so much money that it's just very hard for smaller companies to be in the game. And similarly, you have a lot of monopoly issues. And I've noticed here in Singapore, just an obvious one. I mean, now Grab, is a monopoly. I think I've already noticed the prices going up, I think.
We all have.
Come on, Gojek.
Yeah. So when is Gojek coming? Soon? Yeah. All right, so what more can Singapore do to support another question from the audience here, what more can Singapore do to support startups and kind of develop the truly disruptive innovation? I mean, what can Singapore as a city and a place do?
For me, it's really like I'm an American, and I chose to come to Singapore to innovate, right? And Singapore is really the ideal place, and I'm constantly asking myself, what's the next thing I need? How do I get to the next place? I think our company too, as a culture, is like, how do we get to the next place? And I think Singapore is keeping track with that, right? So regulation helps with that to some degree. You don't want over-regulation, but you want a little bit. Kind of creates a set of bounds to work within. You want like a tech-aware community that has adoption of new technologies, which we obviously have in Singapore. So I think Singapore is the ideal place, and I'm not really sure what the next step is or what else we could do to improve it, because I don't think there's a better place to innovate from my perspective in cybersecurity.
The one thing that I see right now that the ecosystem here is kind of not mature, but maturing a little bit, is that there's so much going in to the funnel from, like, there's so many startups being built and created, and everybody wants to be an entrepreneur now, which is cool. But like, it's, at the end of the day, especially if you have funding involved and so on, you also need to you need to make money and you need to make a business out of it. So how do we ensure that there is a quality in there? Because then at the same time, we also do need eventually those exits. We need those entrepreneurs to, again, fund in the money and put it back into the ecosystem, and we need more, if you really want to make an impact, if you do a business, you really need to kind of have more of those matured startups going to stages and then finally to exit. So really kind of more, not so much more in terms of quantity, but really more in terms of quality as well, and try to carve out that. What I would also, another thing that I would also like to see is obviously there's been a lot of conversations just generally about the funding that, for example, female founders get versus the male founders. And I would love to see more of that diversity in funding, and that people would actually pay attention to that, because I even from our report, so we had one of the sections which was on gender balance, and it was quite interesting. Although there are a lot of researches that talk about when you have a female-run business, they tend to do even better, or at least as good. Even when we asked in our survey whether gender would be a factor when you should be a factor in investing, a majority, men and women, said no. And I kind of understand, because people always say, well, but you should really invest in a person and not so much in a gender. But at the same time, when you look at the statistics, you should invest in businesses that are more likely to succeed. So in a sense, I would really like to see a little bit more of that as well.
Well, and to elaborate on that survey and what people said about gender balance, so you're correct that a majority said you shouldn't consider it, but 35% of women thought it should be considered, and only 2% of men thought it should be considered, which is, a little bit telling. Peng, do you have any thoughts on the gender balance and diversity issue?
Balance,
diversity in general.
I think it's a very hard question, because at some level it's a numeric game. You look at, so what we try to do is less in the market itself, but upstream with scholarships and women in engineering. The average number of women, percentage of women in engineering is about 10, 15, 20% max, right? It's a very unusual school when you have 30+% women in engineering. So 1 out of every 2 founders you see out there is engineering, right? So if you don't have that basis, it cuts off half the opportunities for you. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges. I don't know why. There's tons of reasons, tons of research, but I still don't quite understand why so few women go into engineering today. And that's where the wealth is being created. You talk about AI people, look at their salaries, crazy high salaries, right? If you just have AI. And then computer science relative to, let's say, English majors, computer science is up there, right? So if you're not doing engineering, you're not setting yourself up to be able to generate income, let alone capital gains, right? So my focus is actually on how do you get more women into engineering early on.
Well, and I think one of the things, to the question of why more women don't go into engineering, and it's a complicated question, but certainly, frankly, some of my own anecdotal experiences and observations, and also some research shows that one of the main reasons is that women perceive there's a lot of sexism in the tech business, and they don't want to be in a business where they're going to be, treated as, lesser and discriminated against for their sex. So I think it's kind of, as an editorial comment, I think it's incumbent upon men to be aware of that, and the survey results, show that a bit. So I think we have time for one more question. We don't we don't have time for one more question. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.